of Planning and Research to get us started for this webinar Wednesday. Good afternoon, James.
All right, thank you, William. I appreciate it, and I appreciate all y'all tuning in with us this afternoon during y'all's lunch break. We have a discussion over SB 379 this afternoon, and we have a number of folks from the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. I myself and James Crowder, I'm the Executive Fellow at OPR. We also have Nguyen Tara Key, who is the Deputy Director of Climate Resilience, and she'll be giving a brief presentation here in just a moment. Eric DeCock is with us. He'll be helping answer some of y'all's planning questions as they come in. Alyssa Montañez is with us, and she has put together this webinar, the logistics of it anyway. So thank you, Alyssa, for that. And Nikki Caravelli is with us as well. She's a climate analyst here on the climate team, and she'll be fielding the questions as they come through the Q&A. So thank y'all. And our two panelists today, I'll give a little more information about them a little bit later, but Leanne Singleton is with us here from the city of Hermosa Beach, and Angel Green is with us from Placer County. So here's kind of the agenda and the rundown for today. We're going to be handing this off to Nguyen Tara Key. Again, she's the Deputy Director of Climate Resilience, and she's going to give us a little bit of background on the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program here at OPR, and kind of what that's all about and how that ties into with the rest of the presentation today. After she's done, I'm going to give a brief overview on SB 379 generally, and then I'll be talking about a survey that OPR conducted last year around local jurisdictions' efforts on SB 379. And at that time, we're going to have a little bit of a break, and we're going to take Q&A just on those two sections. So if y'all have questions for myself, for Nguyen Tara Key, or Eric will help answer some of those planning questions as well. Hold them till the end of my presentation, and then y'all have a chance to ask them then. After that Q&A session, we're going to move over to our panelists, and we'll start with Leanne Singleton at Hermosa Beach, and then Angel Green at Placer County. And then after they're done presenting, we'll have another Q&A just for them, so y'all can ask the questions y'all have for them. Again, like William said, if y'all weren't on at that time, this is being recorded, and it will also be streamed on YouTube. And if you want to go back, you can always go to YouTube and rewatch this if you'd like. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nguyen Tara Key, and she's going to tell us a little bit about ICARP.
Great. Thank you so much, James. And James, just let me know if I cut out or you can't hear me at any point. But wonderful to be joining here today. I really appreciate everyone getting on the line with us here for this webinar on SB 379, and thanks to the team for pulling this all together and our local partners for joining us and sharing your expertise on SB 379 implementation. So before we dive into the survey that Jane mentioned and some of the work that we've been doing in that space, I just wanted to give a little bit of context on our Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program at OPR. Our program was established through Senate Bill 246, and our statutory directive through that enabling legislation is to coordinate and align state and local efforts on adaptation and resilience, really with an eye towards supporting local implementation. And from an OPR perspective, when we think about local implementation, that absolutely includes planning and the important role that integrating climate adaptation and resilience plays in the planning space all the way through to individual project implementation as well. So given our broad charge, we're really working to find resources and make sure that on the state side, we're aligning our efforts in the resilience space, again, really to support that local action and implementation. There are two components to our program that I just want to mention because they'll tee up a little bit of the background on the survey that James is going to go into. But in that enabling legislation, there are a couple programmatic elements that we are charged with implementing. One is the development and maintenance of an adaptation clearinghouse. I'll get to that in a minute here, in additional detail here on that in a minute. And we also have a technical advisory council that guides and informs our program and really brings together state and local partners, really again towards figuring out how do we better align our efforts for implementation. And cutting across all of these efforts, two cross-cutting objectives in our enabling statute around our adaptation work that really inform and cut across all the work that we do. One of those is ensuring that we're advancing equity and environmental justice in the context of our adaptation and resilience work. I'll touch on this in a minute, and this was actually also an area of focus for the survey as well. And then the second cross-cutting objective is around supporting an integrated approach to climate change, so linking both adaptation and mitigation as a cohesive framework on climate framework, in California. So that's just a little bit of context and background in kind of our role and the focus for our adaptation program more generally. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, we have our adaptation clearinghouse. The link should work there at the bottom of the page for people to go if you haven't already explored the clearinghouse. It's really intended to support a community of practice around resilience and adaptation across this state. And one of the key areas that we've been focusing on is really thinking about pulling in resources to support local governments in their implementation of SB 379 requirements, or requirements to incorporate climate into the safety element of the general plan, or across the general plan more generally. So we've really been focusing in on the Adaptation Clearinghouse to provide resources there for local governments to use as you're thinking about implementation. So I just wanted to highlight that resource for people who may not know about it. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned before, our advisory council is really intended to be a space to bring our state and local partners together to really help us figure out how we better align our efforts in the adaptation space. And one of the key areas that has come up in our conversation with our council over the last few years has been around SB 379 implementation. And we have been fielding a number of questions, both across our council, but then in other engagement with local governments around what are some of the best practices to implement adaptation and incorporate adaptation into general plan? Or how does SB 379 relate to other general plan requirements that local governments need to meet? So given the kind of frequency and the level of interest and questions we've been fielding both through our council, but then also in engagement with local governments, was one of the reasons for launching this SB 379 survey, which James is gonna speak to in a minute here. Next slide. So one resource I just wanted to pull up here. So in addition to getting general questions around SB 379 implementation, one of the areas where we have continued to receive a number of questions on is how do you start thinking about vulnerability in an adaptation context? And how do you start defining and identifying communities and members within a community that are at increased vulnerability to climate risk? And so this, in addition to the work that I mentioned before around the clearinghouse and pulling resources together, we've been working to pull together additional resources really driving at this question. And in 2018, just for those who may not know, we released this guidance for local governments on how to define vulnerable communities in the context of climate adaptation. So I just wanted to take a minute to highlight that here. The link to that resource is at the bottom of the page. As we've been fielding many questions in this space, that was one of the reasons why we wanted to also issue this SB 379 survey, was to try to get a better sense from our local partners of how communities were starting to define vulnerable communities in the SB 379 379 context. One last thing here, and then I'll hand it back to James. In our Vulnerable Communities Guide that we pulled together, we've also pulled a crosswalk to SB 1000 requirements, or requirements to incorporate environmental justice in a general plan. So you'll see here just a quick snapshot of one of the tables in this guidance document of the considerations and factors that both help understand and identify vulnerability in a climate adaptation context, but also help advance and meet SB 1000 requirements. So just flagging this as a key resource because we've been getting a lot of questions in this area, and want to make sure people on the webinar are aware of the resources we have available. So next slide. I think that's it from my side. I'll hand it back to James now to dig in on the survey.
All right, thank you, Noontar, for that information. And like I said, if any of y'all have questions that y'all want to know more information about what Noontar just spoke to, we're going to have a Q&A right after my presentation to address any of those. And with that, if you have questions, go ahead and type them in the question and answer box, and Nikki will let us know about those when we get to that point. So thank you. So I'm going to give a quick overview on SB 379 itself, and then I'll go into the survey results and why we were doing it in the first place. So SB 379 was passed in 2015, and it requires local jurisdictions to update their safety elements to address climate vulnerability and adaptation. This update is supposed to occur before 2022. There's also a different avenue. So if your local jurisdiction doesn't have a local hazard mitigation plan, 2022 is kind of the date they set. But if you do, it's the next update of the local hazard mitigation plan after 2017. But FEMA requires that LHMP to be done every 5 years. So kind of either way, 2022 is where you want to have that update done by. And though the safety element itself doesn't have to be the place where this information is kept, it's, as I'll talk about in the survey results, many local jurisdictions are doing it that way, but it is okay to incorporate other planning documents into the safety element in order to meet SB 379 requirements. Some additional requirements occurred in 2018 when they passed SB 1035, which requires review and update of specific hazards such as flood and fire and climate adaptation portions of the safety element. And that timing is a little bit different because it coincides with the housing element updates rather than LHMP. So that's done every 8 years. And for y'all that want to go and actually read the bill's text as it's codified, that's found at California Government Code 65302G4, and that's specific to the safety element update. So what does that mean? So these are kind of the main things that SB 379 requires, and they chronologically make sense to kind of do them this way. So the first thing is reviewing existing plans. So local jurisdictions, I mean, good place to start is figuring out what gaps you have in climate adaptation measures and things like that to determine kind of where to start from. And then from there, vulnerability assessments and determining where climate impacts are going to make y'all's communities more vulnerable is the next step. So from that vulnerability assessment, the idea is that you create goals and objectives and policies in order to mitigate and adapt to those impacts that you found during your vulnerability assessment. But that's not the end. We want to make sure that once you've found out these things and you've started planning for them, that you find some way to feasibly implement measures in order to adapt to these impacts that you've assessed. So then at the end, implement it. Like I said, you want to implement these measures that your jurisdiction has created, and aligning with other plans is important. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the survey results here in just a moment. So New and Tara went over quite a bit of the reasons that OPR did the survey in the first place, but really the main purpose was really just to gain insight into how local jurisdictions were tackling SB 379 requirements and what were some of the things they were doing to do that. So we wrote a report for the survey, and that full report, if you want to know more statistics and have a list of the actual questions that were asked and just a little more in-depth information about that, you can go to opr.ca.gov, and up in the right-hand corner there, we have a link that's called publications, and under there's a list of publications in alphabetical order, and you'll find this under S for SB 379. So if y'all want more information on that, it's a good place to start. But some of the main questions that we wanted to get some answers to were what documents were being updated. Again, safety elements, one place to go, but you can also use other planning documents and reference them in the safety element to meet the requirements. We also wanted to know during those vulnerability assessments how local jurisdictions are defining community assets. And as New and Tara said, we also wanted to gain more information on how vulnerable communities were being defined as well. And then, for the folks that were going through it or trying to go through the process, what barriers were they meeting? And then in some cases, how were they getting over those barriers? And then what were some of the successes to updating these documents? And what did local jurisdictions find, helpful in this process? So those were some of the main questions. Like I said, there was actually 10 questions, but some of them are just kind of deviations from these. So here are some of the key findings. So about a quarter of the respondents have actually done the entire process. So figuring out the gap analysis, where they started, all the way to finalizing and adopting the update. And so that survey was done in 2019, and things need to be done by the end of 2021, basically. So still quite a few folks from that sample that have some work to do. But what we did find, as far as what documents were being updated, is that a clear majority of jurisdictions were in fact updating their safety element. And what we also found was that they weren't just updating their safety element, they were also updating a number of other plans in their jurisdiction. And that kind of goes back to aligning plans. A couple of jurisdictions noted specifically that it's easier to update multiple plans at the same time because you're already doing that work. So that kind of helps align, whether it's a climate action plan or your LHMP, or whatever the case may be. So we also asked about timing, just to see where folks are at, because some folks maybe not on the radar. So we wanted to get that out there. And so, like I said, about a quarter had actually completed it at the time of the survey. And then about a quarter of them said that they'd have it done by the end of this year. And then another quarter of folks didn't have any idea. So that obviously leaves the last 25% or so in 2021 somewhere. But a lot of folks hadn't started yet, or didn't have any idea when that might be finalized or adopted. One of the good things that we saw was that the majority of jurisdictions had identified vulnerable communities. It was an open-ended question, so we did get quite a few different answers because it wasn't like a drop-down answer. But the majority of those who had identified vulnerable communities fell in either socioeconomic status of some kind. Age was a big thing, and mobility associated with that, and English as a second language was also a common thread. And when disasters occur, you gotta be able to communicate with everybody. So I think that's why those are the three main categories. And then there was a handful of jurisdictions that really just stated, vulnerable communities are the folks who are going to be more susceptible when disaster occurs or when climate impacts start to impact the community. So a lot of the jurisdictions had not defined community assets, and the ones that had really leaned on physical structures that the jurisdiction either owned or leased. Those was kind of the big thing. There was, I think, 2 or 3 that said natural resources and natural infrastructure, as well as cultural heritage sites were defined or included in their community assets. And then we kind of got to the barriers, and for some of y'all, this might be surprising, and for a lot of y'all, it might not be, but the overwhelming majority of folks who submitted an answer for what barriers, it was funding and or lack of organizational capacity. So, we understand that, especially now, this survey was in 2019 and lots changed since then. So we understand that those are always going to be, barriers that local jurisdictions are going to come up against in the planning realm. But some of the successes that jurisdictions said, finding funding, this kind of created an opportunity, if not a little bit of a push, to go out there and find some planning dollars to get these updates completed. A couple of the other things that jurisdictions noted were it provided a kind of organic opportunity to engage with the community members and see, what their concerns were and things like that, as well as working across departments. I think a couple of folks said, in the planning department, we don't always talk to the people at the Parks and Rec department, so on and so forth. So it was a time to, kind of get out of silos and connect with other folks. So kind of the next steps, how we're going to use that information, or how we can use that information. One of the things that OPR does, for y'all that don't know, we put out the general plan guideline updates, and we also put out the annual planning survey. And so these results may help create additional questions for the annual planning survey and might guide some of the updates to the general plan guidelines. As well as New and Taros speaking to ICARP's programmatic work, both with the Technical Advisory Council and the Adaptation Clearinghouse, and just using both of those programs to help support and provide resources to local jurisdictions who are trying to, meet the SB 379 requirements. And one thing I didn't mention before, because I didn't want to confuse anybody, but we did happen to get quite a few responses from special districts, such as regional transportation districts and water districts and things like that. They don't have to do SB 379 requirements. That's not something they do, but it did show that a lot of these folks are looking at climate adaptation measures and planning and things like that. So we might look into producing some kind of guidance or resources specifically for those special districts. So that is the gist of the survey. Like I said, if y'all want to find out more, it's on opr.ca.gov under publications, and y'all can find it under S down there. So at this time, I'm going to open it up. Nikki, let us know who has questions, and either myself, New and Tara, or Eric will do our best to answer them at this time.
Yeah, thanks, James. Can you remind me how much time we have for this portion for Q&A?
I believe we have about 10 minutes for this Q&A.
Great, because we do have quite a few questions coming in. The first few that I saw were just, could Eric or you, James, provide clarification on which documents need to be updated? Does it have to be a local hazard mitigation or the general plan, or can you update a climate action plan and reference it in the safety element? Can you just provide a little clarification on that?
Hi, Nikki. I'm happy to answer that. So SB 379 requires local governments to address climate adaptation and the safety element of the general plan. Now, there are provisions in the bill and in the statute as amended that allow local governments to incorporate other types of climate adaptation or climate related plans. Even a local hazard mitigation plan can be used to meet the requirements. The caveat is that all of the statutory requirements for the safety element must be met in those separate plans. So if a local government chooses to take that pathway, you just need to make sure that you're consistent with the law. And we do have guidance on some of those approaches in our general plan guidelines in the safety elements section under chapter 4, which is called required elements. I'll also let folks know that if you haven't seen it already, we do have a newly updated climate adaptation planning guide for California communities looking at doing climate adaptation work. So some of this those type of integrated approaches are also sort of addressed in that adaptation planning guide.
Awesome, thank you, Eric. We also had a couple questions come in about the timing. So for instance, if you start your update to your general plan in 2023, or if your FEMA update requires the next update and that falls in 2023, if jurisdictions start, can you just provide a little bit more clarification about the 2022 date? Is that the latest that folks can start their update?
This is a great question, and one that we've been getting pretty frequently since SB 379 was signed into law. Like several of the more recent changes to general plan requirements, the legislature has chosen to use the word upon, which isn't exactly clear about the exact timing. Is that a time at which you start? Is that a time which you must be finished? So that we don't necessarily know exactly how to best answer that question. I will say that the intent here seems to be that the local hazard mitigation plan and its role in looking at hazards and climate related hazards in particular as an opportunity to sort of sync up some of this really important planning work around climate and climate driven or climate exacerbated hazards. That said, the law does not say concurrently with or at the same time as. But obviously it would make good planning sense to do that coordinated updates if you can. But OPR would just basically say that we leave it to the local agency and your own legal counsel to decide whether you interpret that as a deadline or as a point at which you must at least be in process or begin the process. So definitely not something we're willing to say exactly what it means, but hopefully that general response provides just some general direction on how best to move forward.
Thanks, Eric. And then we have a question about the survey responses from Laura Tam. Did any of the jurisdictions incorporate findings or information revealed in updating their local hazard mitigation plan and safety elements into their housing or land use elements? Was that addressed in the survey?
So not specifically, but we did ask folks to identify if they were updating multiple planning documents, and there were the report will, if you want to go look at that, and I don't remember quite off the top of my head, but there were a majority of folks who were updating multiple documents, and sometimes they were LHMPs. I think there was a couple sea level rise documents that people were updating. So we don't have like specifics on what everyone was doing, but quite a few people were updating multiple documents at the same time.
And then does a follow-up question to that was, does OPR review these updated safety elements in terms of either the public process, their completeness, or inclusion of state guidance on things like sea level rise projections or wildfire risk?
I can take this one. OPR does not actually engage in formal review of our of general plans that are drafted in California. We're happy to answer questions about the guidance that we provide and sort of engage in technical assistance or consultation on that level. But we do not have formal review and comment authority. We don't have legal regulatory jurisdiction over anyone's general plan. So just make sure everyone understands that. But again, we're happy to talk through the guidance, or if folks are looking for information on how to meet the requirements or pathways that can be taken, we're always happy to engage in that conversation.
Awesome.
All right, Nikki, I think we have time for one more question if you have one.
Okay. I do. I have one that's really quick, and then I'll ask a final one. So the quick one is, what was the sample size of the survey?
It turned out to be about 57 jurisdictions who we got who said they were actually updating it, and so that's the sample size that we used.
Okay. And then Hannah asked if we can provide a link to the adaptation planning document Eric referenced. Yes, we can definitely provide that in the chat. And then the last question I'm going to ask, and apologies if we didn't get to your question, but we will have a larger question and answer section at the end of this, so we can potentially try and answer it there. The last question is, can you speak a little bit more about who this survey was directed to? Was it directed to the staff level or the directors of planning departments or public works departments? How was it delivered? And did you ask questions related to respondents' understanding of these topics or time spent working on climate-related issues?
So the survey, the methodology in the report really goes into detail about this, but basically it was kind of an extension of the annual planning survey and folks who had said that they had begun the process of SB 379 meeting those requirements. And so we reached out to them. We also reached out through various networks to get folks to answer these questions. And so the respondents weren't always like the head of planning or things like that. Sometimes it was consultants who were helping the jurisdictions and things like that. So that's kind of who it was really geared toward those folks who had answered certain questions on the annual planning survey in a specific way.
Okay. Thanks, James. And it looks like, so Eric is answering people's questions as well in the chat. So thank you, Eric, for doing that. I think that's all the time that we have for Q&A at this time, right?
Yeah, awesome, thank you.
I would just, apologies really quickly, just to get at the second half of the question, that last question around asking questions related to respondents' understanding of the topics and time spent working on related issues. We didn't address that specifically in the SB 379 survey, but it is something that we ask more generally in the annual planning survey around local jurisdiction capacity and time, capacity and resources across a whole number of different planning areas, climate adaptation being one of them. So we do have additional information on that in the annual planning survey, but it wasn't specifically focused on in the SB 379.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you all for y'all's questions. These are great. We're gonna move on to our panelists now. I'm happy to introduce Leanne Singleton from the city of Hermosa Beach. She's an environmental analyst there, and she's going to give some background on what they did for meeting SB 379 requirements, and especially in a coastal area and some of the things that they took into consideration there. So Leanne, thank you for being with us today, and you can take it from here.
Perfect. Thanks so much for having me today. I'm excited to talk a little bit about the city of Hermosa Beach and our experience in updating our general plan, our coastal land use plan, and our hazard mitigation plan in an effort to integrate climate mitigation and adaptation into all of those documents in a way to meet the SB 379 requirements. So for those that are not familiar with Hermosa Beach, we're a small, dense coastal city in LA County, about 20,000 residents and 1.4 square miles. And obviously the 2 miles of shoreline that we have is probably our greatest asset. And so sea level rise, climate adaptation, and what that looks like for Hermosa Beach in the future is of critical importance to much of our community. I can go ahead to the next slide there. So the city's general plan update process predated me in terms of being an employee there at the city, but I was involved in the consulting team back in 2013. And before the city got started, it was really important to lay out a plan or an approach to identify the various studies and policy documents that were needed, and working on how to piece together different funding sources to accomplish all of the different plans that needed to be updated. Go to the next slide there. So what is it that we updated? Plan Hermosa was our city's general plan and the coastal land use plan that was integrated into one document. That was initiated in 2013. And then the city's hazard mitigation plan relied on many of the studies that were prepared for the general plan. And that was initiated in 2017 and adopted in 2018. Our process specifically predated the SB 379 guidance, since it was initiated back in 2013, but by the time we adopted in 2017, we did specifically incorporate sections into our resolutions that described how we met each element of SB 379 through our process. You can go to the next slide there. In terms of integration, half of our city is located within the coastal zone and subject to the Coastal Act. And so for the city of Hermosa Beach, it made sense to combine into one plan the different policies to meet both the Coastal Act as well as the general plan guidelines. And so the chart that's shown on the screen here kind of lays out a matrix of what the coastal element or the Coastal Act requirements are, and then what our general plan chapters and how different topics are covered within each of those. Public safety for sure overlaps with the Coastal Act requirements for coastal hazards and shoreline erosion and protective devices. And the local hazard mitigation plan is required to address natural hazards. And I'll share climate change mitigation and adaptation play a role in most elements of our general plan. In terms of how we implemented our planning process, we certainly relied on the state agency guidance documents that have been published over the last number of years and the tools that are there. So the adaptation planning guide, CalAdapt, to be able to see at a higher level what some of the metrics or risks are. And then the Coastal Commission sea level rise guidance, certainly another resource we used as we developed our policy documents. In terms of funding, I mentioned that we pieced together a couple of different funding resources. And so we were able to identify different components to get funded in different ways. And so we had approximately $400,000 in grants from the Strategic Growth Council. We received $235,000 thereabout from the Coastal Commission in updating the Coastal Land Use Plan, or the LCP component. And another, I believe it was $25,000 for FEMA for our hazard mitigation plan. Those paired with, we have a local general plan implementation fee that is charged to all development projects. And that gave us the funding for our smaller community to be able to hire the technical expertise and the consulting team needed to develop these documents. I can go on to the next slide there. I'll talk a little bit about the technical studies that were conducted as part of this. You can switch to the next slide. For us, we really focused on identifying what the types of hazards were, and then recognizing which hazards are expected to increase in their severity and or their frequency with climate change. And for our small community, severe weather, flooding and sea level rise, drought, and extreme heat are some of the key highest risk hazards as it relates to climate change. I can go to the next slide. We conducted two vulnerability studies. One was a social vulnerability study, and the other was infrastructure vulnerability. Given that sea level rise was our kind of highest risk, the studies themselves were specifically designed to address our sea level rise impacts, but the demographic analysis that was conducted as part of the social vulnerability also helped with our hazard mitigation planning to evaluate other hazards. Go on to the next slide there. In terms of social vulnerabilities, we identified a number of key community groups or community members that are at particularly high risk. Renter occupied, I believe almost 60% of our community is renter occupied households. And in particular, the most vulnerable areas, the southern coastal portion of our city is 76% renter occupied. That's important with a reduced capacity to actually make changes to reduce vulnerabilities to buildings that renters don't own. In terms of other vulnerabilities that we've found, high housing cost burden. We have a number of elderly and very young, which are generally more vulnerable, disabled population, and then those experiencing homelessness as kind of our key social vulnerabilities that were identified through this study. In terms of our infrastructure vulnerabilities, we looked at these in a similar manner to the Coastal Act requirements to help set up that framework for evaluating our community assets. So, our public access facilities, looking at what are our physical infrastructure to help people access the coast, as well as our recreational facilities, our visitor serving facilities, and then our infrastructure. For Hermosa Beach, we are very much a tourist-based economy or a visitor-based economy, and people come to access the beach. So for those reasons, they're key infrastructure assets that we want to make sure that we identify within our both our coastal plan as well as our local hazard mitigation plan. And so those were further evaluated within the hazard mitigation plan. In terms of communicating risks, you can go on to the next slide here. This is one of my key areas that I enjoy talking about, just in terms of the challenges associated with communicating some of this. And certainly lessons learned. These are not all things that we implemented through our process, but things that we have learned since our process of updating all of these documents. One of the key things or takeaways that I've learned over the years is that maximizing consistency is really important when communicating with your residents. There are so many studies and sets of data out there at the local, regional, state, and national level, and they all vary in terms of the terminology that's used, the units of measurement that are used, the data methods, the data sources. So my advice to those that are embarking on this process is certainly make sure you review the data and select the sources that best fit your needs, and then use them consistently across documents and through your policy development. I can't tell you how many times through this process we would reference, 150 centimeters of sea level rise predicted by 2100, or 55 inches was then translated into 150 inches. When 55 inches and 150 centimeters are pretty close to the same. And so just selecting at the beginning of this process, once you look at all of the data that's out there, selecting and staying consistent is one of the things that I think is kind of a lesson learned from our experience for sure. And then just using similar policy language, similar graphics and terminology across all of your documents can help reduce the potential for confusion. It reinforces the importance of the key strategies that you're hoping to implement, and improves the ability to implement, because you can point to any of your documents and it's showing and reflecting the same data terminology. It just adds to greater consistency and understanding. You can go ahead to the next slide. For our hazard mitigation plan, we looked at climate change both as a standalone hazard and really focused on what the extent of future impacts were based on global efforts to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And it provided an opportunity, looking at it as a standalone hazard, to integrate actual mitigation efforts for greenhouse gases into our LHMP and address multiple hazards with similar policies. And I say that because a lot of times FEMA will fund mitigation programs, but they must be in your hazard mitigation plan. And so if you have greenhouse gas mitigation and a standalone hazard of climate change, the opportunity to actually use FEMA funding for some of those is increased. And then we also looked at it as a component of other hazards. So showing how each hazard may be more frequent or more severe with climate change was another angle that we took within our hazard mitigation plan, thinking about not just the direct effects, but also the indirect effects. So thinking about how does your tsunami run up increase as your base flood elevations increase. So thinking ahead a step to here's what your tsunami run up inundation looks like today, but here's how it may look in the future with climate change. You can go ahead to the next slide. Back to communications in terms of how do we communicate the risks. I think certainly most folks are more familiar with maps these days because they're on our phones. We're constantly looking at them to get directions, to find things. But there is still a challenge in communicating risks through maps. I think as planners, we often like to use maps, but they're not always the most effective and can be confusing from time to time. So with that, I will share that maps are good. Images are better. And yeah, you got to click through these. This is a project that we implemented actually post general plan and hazard mitigation plan update, but we actually went through the process of creating 3D virtual reality of some of our key locations in Hermosa Beach that are likely to become flooded either on a temporary basis with coastal storms or on a permanent basis. And images really help to tell that picture far better than a map will. And go ahead to the next slide there. And then backing up your maps and your images with numbers to help tell the full story, that's important as well. And so for our community, noting on a map an area, but backing that up with a note that says we could see a 300% increase in the flood area, and that has the impact or the potential to impact 200 residential and commercial buildings within our community and 1,000 residents, helps to kind of paint that complete picture. For Hermosa Beach, in terms of our physical assets, we also noted we have 50 sewer segments, loss of some of our stormwater infrastructure, including our infiltration trench. We have the potential for our beach restrooms to be flooded. Our beach restrooms are actually set lower into the ground so that they're not as visually intrusive, but that, as we renovate those, we have to think about whether or not those may be potentially flooded in the future. You can go ahead to the next slide here. And then the last couple of slides that I'll talk through is our policy development. So for Hermosa Beach, because this was part of a comprehensive, and you can go to the next slide, because this was part of a comprehensive general plan process where we started with the visioning of what we want our community to be in the future, we really relied on the community vision that talked about environmental leadership, retaining our quality of life, the economic and fiscal stability, and to be willing to try and innovate and try new things. By looking at resilience and adaptation through the lens of our community values, we've been able to align our policies with other initiatives to identify solutions that achieve multiple benefits. So addressing an infrastructure project that also considers stormwater and pedestrian safety into the same thing as part of our economic and fiscal stability and as part of our quality of life, we've been able to build greater community support for the implementation of key projects and articulate the benefits and how this ties back to the community's vision. In terms of the community engagement, the general plan update itself had more than 40 community meetings, so I won't dive into all of the community engagement that we covered. But there were a couple of unique outreach methods that we utilized during the process or as part of our implementation. And it really included an emphasis on walking tour workshops. So rather than having everyone stand around a map in a room, we took a Saturday morning and we walked a mile or two and had some key questions for people to think about, observe, and report back on during the process. We also held some youth charrettes. So really asking, what is it that our youth want to see? How do they perceive our community today, and what would they like to see in the future? And that was a really I think productive process and kind of simplifying. Sometimes as adults we dive into the weeds of where we want to go and what we want to accomplish. And I think the youth perspective was simplified and clear, and it was consistent, but it was very clear. And then, as I mentioned before, we did our Look Ahead project, which was the implementation of our sea level rise through virtual reality. And you can see on the image here, this is one of our, I think it was an NBC reporter that has the headset on and the controllers and is looking around. And it was kind of a fun experience to see people get engrossed within the world of virtual reality, and they can look 360 degrees and see what that same spot that they're standing at might look like in the future. In terms of our policy development, really thinking about the consideration of 4 key things. So consideration of the people, the built environment, the natural resources, and the economic resources. Looking at all of the potential, there's so many options out there in terms of how we actually develop and implement policy, but keeping in mind those 4 key components has helped us to focus in on what are the policies that are going to be, that balance all of those 4 aspects most effectively. Go on to the next slide. So I think I've mentioned this before, but both mitigation and adaptation to climate change were central components of our Plan HERMOSA update. In combination with our environmental impact report for the general plan, we've been able to designate that as the city's qualified greenhouse gas reduction strategy, and set long-term GHG reduction goals for both the community and municipal operations. And the policies that we included in here were really meant to cross over between both our hazard mitigation plan and our public safety element. Some last key takeaways that we've learned through this process: really incorporating similar policies across documents, making cross references between plans. I like to say this is like a reminder to our future selves that we look at when we're opening up the public safety element and reviewing that and considering amendments, making sure that we're also looking at our hazard mitigation plan and vice versa. From our perspective, it increases the opportunity for funding. It reduces the potential for inconsistencies, and it reminds our future selves or future planners, maybe if it's not ourselves, to consider the plans in conjunction with each other. And then aligning policies with other initiatives, really the ability to implement solutions that have multiple benefits, in our opinion, creates greater support for implementation. And using the resolutions, this is, I think, something I referenced earlier, but we really made use of our resolutions when we adopted both our general plan and our hazard mitigation plan to explain the compliance with the legislation. So just trying to tick through each of the different legislative components that we were trying to achieve through this. In a couple of sentences on each item, we were able to cover what and how we've met those different criteria. Then the implementation initiatives, these are 6 kind of key things that we're working on today to be able to actually implement our climate adaptation and resiliency projects. And some of them are already in progress, some of them still need to be started, but really the zoning code update, so taking what our general plan says and incorporating that into our municipal code. Our Look Ahead project, as I mentioned, making sure that we're incorporating this into our private development projects, so the policies there, mostly through the EIR process. And then incorporating these into our CIP and infrastructure projects. And my colleagues probably don't love me for this, but every staff report that goes to council now has a general plan consistency component to it. And so they are all now very familiar with the general plan and the policies in there. And it really helps to reinforce a document that was 5 years in the making after 40 years of not having an updated general plan, that kind of reinforces and helps the policies remain relevant. And that's all I've got.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leanne, for that wonderful presentation. For any of y'all that have questions, we will be answering them after we have Angel Green from Placer County give her presentation. So this presentation will be a little bit different because Placer County is a little bit bigger, and it contains both rural and urban situated folks. So Angel is going to take it from here and tell us about some of the things they did for meeting SB 379 and some of their other planning efforts.
Well, thank you, James, and thank you for the invitation. Again, my name is Angel Green, Senior Planner with Placer County. I'm also the Project Manager for the Placer County Sustainability Plan. If you want to go ahead and click to the next slide. So Placer County is located in Northern California, and it's part of the greater Sacramento metropolitan area. Stretches roughly 65 miles from the urban suburbs at Roseville through the Gold Country foothills, all the way into the high Sierras at North Lake Tahoe, all the way to the Nevada border. Placer has a population of over 398,000 folks, encompasses about a total of 1,500 square miles. Placer is well known for a wide variety of agricultural commodities, including rice and mandarins and wine grapes, with more than 1,200 farms and cattle ranches. Also, it's all seasonal recreational opportunities that we have up in Lake Tahoe. But Placer is also known for its fair share of public safety power shutoffs and heavily vegetated high fire severity zones subject to wildfire and other implications of climate change. So you can go ahead and click to the next slide. And I'll provide just a brief overview of the Placer County Sustainability Plan. So in January, earlier this year, the Placer County Board of Supervisors adopted its first Placer County Sustainability Plan. Sometimes we refer to this plan as a climate action plan or a greenhouse gas reduction strategy. The sustainability plan is a strategic county-wide plan and outlines various programs and policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to build resiliency against climate risks. The plan includes two main components. The first is the greenhouse gas reduction program, and this includes an emission inventory, which identifies key sources of emissions within the community as well as county operations. The second component is the adaptation strategy, and this did include a vulnerability assessment, which allowed the county to identify strategies and resources necessary to improve resiliency against climate-related hazards in Placer County. And the current status, as I mentioned, this plan was adopted just earlier this year. We are currently in the process of updating our safety element to incorporate the goals and policies of the sustainability plan. And this effort is running collectively with our housing element update as well. All right, so for the next slide, I'll speak just a little bit about the vulnerability assessment that was prepared. This was completed in 2018. It was the county's first vulnerability assessment. Was prepared in support with our consultant team led by PlaceWorks, as well as a technical advisory committee consisting of key staff and various departments and divisions. This assessment and the subsequent adaptation strategies were prepared to support the county's compliance with the statutory requirements established by Senate Bill 379. The vulnerability assessment also followed the recommended process in the California Adaptation Planning Guide, referred to as the APG. The APG was published in 2012 by the California Natural Resource Agency, and I believe Cal OES might have been involved with that as well. It guides regional and local governments in identifying and reducing harmful effects of climate change. The county did rely on several local plans and reports to prepare the vulnerability assessment, which did include the county's local hazard mitigation plan, which was completed in 2016, but unfortunately did not address climate change. A few of the other local plans did include the county's general plan, agricultural crop reports, homeless count reports, other local sustainability and climate action plans that have been prepared, as well as the county's conservation plan. I don't have listed here, but we did include a number of state and federal data, such as the National Climate Assessment, the California Natural Resources Agency's Safeguarding California, and the California Climate Adaptation Strategy reports, information from the California Energy Commission and the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. The U.S. Census Bureau was used for demographic data, including information about the numbers and locations of disadvantaged persons in the community. And we also used CalAdapt for historic climate conditions and future projections. I want to go ahead and click to the next slide. So as previously mentioned, this vulnerability assessment was prepared following those recommendations in the APG. And the APG recommends this 5-step method when preparing a vulnerability assessment. Step 1, to identify exposures. So the first step of the vulnerability assessment was to figure out which effects are expected to take place or are already occurring in Placer County. Step 2, to identify sensitivities. And for Placer, this included groups of people as well as community assets such as buildings, infrastructure, and government services. Step 3, to analyze potential impacts necessary to see how climate change will affect the people and the assets in Placer County and in what ways. Step 4, evaluate adaptive capacity. An adaptive capacity is the ability of people and assets to recover from and adapt to the impacts of climate change. And last, adjust for risk and onset. So some of the impacts of climate change in Placer are much more likely to occur than others. So for example, climate change may affect the frequency of tornadoes in Placer County, but since these hazards are rare in the area, the risk from them would be low. And some impacts were also not expected to occur in a significant way for several decades. For the assessment process, after selecting the exposures and sensitivities to include in the vulnerability assessment, we wanted to keep with the method of the APG. Placer County decided to look at which exposures are likely to affect which sensitivities. And based on the results of the assessment, the county then ranked each sensitivity on a 5-point scale system, so 0 to 5 for each of those relevant exposures. And I'll just briefly cover those in the next few slides if you want to go ahead and click on the next slide. So in selecting the various exposures or climate-related hazards to be considered in the assessment, in addition to consideration of the local data that I'd shared, staff also worked with the county's Office of Emergency Services, our Firewise Alliance groups, and other special districts, as well as with our Agricultural Commissioner. We also reached out to a number of members of the public and asked them to weigh in on the topics as part of the initial phase of our public engagement effort for our sustainability plan. So with that, the county selected these 11 exposures to consider in its vulnerability assessment. And as you can see here, those included agriculture and forestry, pests and diseases, avalanches, drought, extreme heat, flooding, fog, human health hazards, landslides, severe weather, severe winter weather, and wildfire. On the next slide, for the selected populations and assets, the APG provides a general list of populations and assets to include in your vulnerability assessment. Placer County did revise this list to be more appropriate to the county and to ensure that the vulnerability assessment looked at all sensitivities that were important to our communities. In total, Placer County identified 58 distinct populations and assets, and they were organized into these 6 categories that you see here. For populations, our vulnerability assessment looked at 14 different population types that may be disproportionately harmed by the effects of climate change, and these included children, homeless persons, outdoor workers, persons in poverty, persons with chronic health problems, senior citizens, and more. For infrastructure, we had 13 different types, that were considered, some publicly owned by Placer County or other government agencies, and many others that were privately owned. Building and facilities, which included public and private structures, homes, and community parks, and those sorts. Economic drivers that serve as the primary contributors to Placer County's economy were also considered. In this category covered 10 primary economic drivers, including our agricultural operations, outdoor recreation facilities, and various major employers. For ecosystems, we use the 17 primary ecosystems that were found. This was according to the state's California Wildlife Habitat Relationships classification system. So there were 17 that were included there. And then for services, we had 6 key services that were examined: communication, energy delivery, services, emergency medical response were just a few that were included. So if we go to the next slide, among the 14 different populations analyzed, our assessment did determine we had 9 that scored either a V4 or a V5 or at least one of those exposure types. At least one population group, our senior citizens living alone, scored at least a V4 for 10 of the 11 exposures that we assessed in our study. And here's just a snapshot of the vulnerable population types with a score of V5 or higher. Those included homeless persons, households in poverty, senior citizens, and as I previously mentioned, senior citizens living alone. For homeless persons, we found that they are highly susceptible to extreme heat, human health hazards, and severe weather. Because many of the homeless persons in Placer County are unsheltered, meaning that they do not live in even in temporary housing, they're much more exposed to the extreme weather conditions, much more likely to experience dehydration, heat-related illness, hypothermia, and exposure to disease-carrying pests. Senior citizens and evacuations, that was another alarming thing that came from our analysis. So with evacuations being one of the biggest challenges here in Placer County in improving resiliency with our senior citizens, especially those living alone, many of them have difficulty seeing or hearing, have cognitive impairments and mobility issues, making it much more challenging for these folks to recognize when evaluations will be necessary, let's say in terms of a wildfire evacuation. Some senior citizens have little or no access to transportation, further impeding evacuations. These factors were apparent in the 2017 Northern California fires, where most of the individuals that were lost during those events were senior citizens. In terms of identifying vulnerable communities, the county did use the American Community Survey data, which includes the number of people who are considered members of vulnerable populations within a given block group. Social vulnerability index was then prepared, which allowed the county to look at the proportion of people within each of those groups who belong to each vulnerable population. So those areas with a high proportion of people belonging to several vulnerable populations are considered highly vulnerable communities, and areas with a low proportion of people belonging to one of those groups or few vulnerable populations are considered less vulnerable. The results of the Social Vulnerability Index did show that 8 communities had very high levels of social vulnerability. So on the next slide for our community assets, if you want to go ahead and click.
I'm going to interrupt you real quick, sorry. I just want to give you about a 5-minute warning so that we can make sure that we get to questions at 1:15.
Okay, I'll do my best to run through here. Okay. All right. So for community assets, we do define those as a valued feature of the community that may be harmed by climate change. And for our analysis, that did include buildings, facilities, key services, and ecosystems, economic drivers, and infrastructure. Our vulnerability assessment did include and identify a number of those assets that would be impacted by climate events. So just real quickly, a few here for our ecosystems. We had 3 out of 6 within that category that scored V4 or V5. Conifer forests, grasslands, and mountain meadows were found to be the most vulnerable. For economic drivers, we had 8 out of 10 that were considered highly vulnerable, including farms, orchards, livestock, outdoor recreation, ski resorts, and water recreation sites. For infrastructure, we had 6 out of 13 that were high, including bridges and roadways, buildings and facilities as well. We had homes, community facilities, and regional parks, most vulnerable. And for our key services, the 2 most highly vulnerable were communication and energy delivery. In here, I've just included just a short snippet of the most vulnerable, but we do have our complete report on the county's website. So if we click to the next slide, I'll just briefly cover the implementation strategy. So our sustainability plan, we had 111 adaptation strategies necessary to mitigate and build resiliency. We had another 120 plus strategies to reduce emissions. So to ensure successful implementation of the sustainability plan, we did include an implementation program to help demonstrate the county's goals to reduce its emissions and build resiliency. I've included just two of those strategies here on an annual basis to monitor and report the county's progress towards achieving those targets and improving resiliency. And strategy 4, to continue to seek secure funding sources necessary to implement that plan. We did form a countywide department collaborative to explore funding opportunities where we meet on a quarterly basis. It includes staff from our OES and CEO offices and our agricultural commissioner. Let's see, and by including the greenhouse gas reduction program, just want to kind of add this in here. Our feeling here was that by including that and demonstrating the county's goals here to reduce emissions, that it would also better position the county to obtain additional funding necessary to support many of the resiliency strategies here. For the next slide, for our outreach engagement, I'll just briefly mention here that the sustainability plan was developed with extensive public input over a 2.5-year process. We held a number of meetings with our municipal advisory committees. We have 13. We also held 2 series of workshops throughout the county. First series of meetings was held very early in the process to share preliminary results and to initiate early engagement on the greenhouse gas reduction and adaptation strategies. A couple of other avenues. We do have a dedicated web page that allowed us to engage with folks online. We posted surveys, reached out to local news groups, and also posted on social media and e-blasts. We also met with stakeholders early in the process and also included our interested parties as well early in that process to identify any issues early in the process. For lessons learned on the next slide, I should wrap up here in just a minute. So lessons learned early on. So my recommendation for folks that are starting this process is to form a technical advisory committee, include a number of your key internal staff from various departments and divisions that would not just help shape what information needs to be covered in the vulnerability assessment, but also many of those departments would be implementing a number of those strategies throughout the process. So we did include folks from our OES department, CAL FIRE, local fire districts, our ag commissioner, and our CEO staff. You'll also want to be sure that your TAC folks do have a clear understanding of what the overall goals are and the regulatory requirements for SB 379 and what your expectations are from those members. Also preparing an outreach strategy, that was very helpful for us, identifying your key stakeholders and a list of your interested parties early on in the process, identifying your appropriate locations and how you'll conduct workshops. So certainly with COVID, trying to come up with a framework that would work and be able to reach out to a number of folks throughout your county. Messaging was definitely a a big factor here for the success for our plan. Here in Placer, we have a number of NIMBYs, and we have a large Tea Party group here. Many of these folks, you know, may not believe in climate change, but have been impacted to some degree. Many of them impacted by wildfire, loss of insurance on their homes, and then also impacted by public power shutoffs. So finding a way to communicate the benefits of this plan that they can relate to. So sometimes speaking to the science behind climate change and emission reductions and those types of studies, most folks might not be able to truly understand those, but when you can speak to how they're impacted directly and what they would be able to benefit from in this plan, definitely would help with the success of your plan. So I'm probably out of time here, so I'll just conclude with my last slide here. We've got many of the documents that I've mentioned are available on the county's webpage at Sustain Placer. And I also have my contact information here. If there's any questions, folks can certainly feel free to reach out to me after this presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. So with that, James, I'll go ahead and conclude there.
All right. Thank you so much, Angela's wonderful presentation on Placer County. And before we get into Q&A, I just want to remind everybody that our panelists have agreed to, if y'all want, be reached out to offline after this, and here's their contact information. So with that, Nikki, if you want to go ahead and get us started with some questions.
Yeah, hi everyone again. Thanks Angel and Leanne for great presentations. We have a couple questions coming in. Folks, if you have questions specific to Angel and Leanne, please type those in now. And then later, if we have time, we'll address more general questions. And I just wanted to make a quick note as well. That Adaptation Planning Guide has been brought up a few times as a resource for communities, and has been updated over the last year or so, and it will soon be published by the Office of Emergency Services. And I just wanted to note for folks that we are in the process of integrating that planning guide onto the Adaptation Clearinghouse. New and Tara provided the link to it earlier. It's resilientca.org. So over the next few months into the fall, we will be having a public process where you can provide feedback on how that guide looks online. We're going to create an interactive online environment for viewing the guidance, and then it will be fully released and ready and usable with downloadable templates and tools and that sort of thing, again, on the Adaptation Clearinghouse. So just wanted to plug that in there. So the first question that I have is one actually for Leanne. Leanne, someone wants to know, how much did the local hazard mitigation plan update cost? And overall, how much did your, or how did you fund all of your SB 379 planning efforts?
So I'll start with the overall costs. Our general plan update, I think, was about a $1.3 million contract. And I think we had about half of that was covered through grants. And the rest of it, I mentioned, we set up, I believe it was probably 5 or so years prior to a general plan update, but we set up a specific fee called the general plan implementation fee that was collected on development projects that actually gave us the funding for the rest of it. So it was all dedicated fees, didn't have to come from general fund. And then on the hazard mitigation plan, I would need to follow up on that, as it was led by our emergency management department.
Awesome, thank you, Leanne. I have a question for Angel. Angel, what scale did you use for the social vulnerability index? Was that census block group or census tract?
It was the census block data.
Awesome. And how did you decide which scale to choose?
You know, I'm not quite sure.
No worries.
I'll have to look back into that and maybe get back to you on that. But yeah, I don't recall here at the moment.
Okay.
Great. Sorry about that.
No worries. Okay, so before we get into more general questions, we have one more for both Angel and Leanne, unless anyone has additional to submit. How were your plans incorporated into your annual budgeting process over the years of your planning process, or into this year?
I can go ahead and start. So since the adoption of our plans, I mentioned essentially all of our policy documents, all of our staff reports now include general plan consistency analysis. And then within our budgeting process, we also look at what are the key implementation programs and priorities and work towards integrating those into our capital improvement program and then our planning department budget. So they're responsible for the development of our zoning code update. And that's a key kind of vehicle that we're using to implement and further our SB 379 compliance.
And for Placer, yeah, we pretty much have a similar process. Each of the different divisions and departments that are responsible for implementing various components of the sustainability plan utilize their existing budgets to determine what would be necessary for implementation. We're in the process of integrating the implementation program right now. So we do have a few departments that do have concerns in regards to lack of funding or oversight to fully implement a few of the strategies in the plan. So we're going through the process to rectify those issues and to reach out to our board to see where additional funding can help support many of those efforts.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions specific to Angel or Leanne. So we'll just open it up to some of these questions for the whole panel. We have one from Natalie. Has any jurisdiction found a way to fund housing or services for the homeless population through FEMA funding, since homeless populations show up as vulnerable in planning for hazards?
Nikki, can you repeat that one more time?
Yep. And I think you and Tara, this might be maybe a question that you can take a stab at. It's a general question for all our panelists. Has any jurisdiction found a way to fund housing or services for homeless populations through FEMA funding?
I do want to say that, so we're going through the process of updating our housing element right now. And if I'm not mistaken, we were successful just recently obtaining some funding for the homeless population. You'll have to forgive me. There's a particular name of the grant funding, and I believe it's through FEMA that we were successful at obtaining. But we're looking at a number of those opportunities to be able to fund those efforts. So I know that that's something that's definitely high on Placer County's list to tackle and continue to keep an eye on.
Yeah, and this is new, and Tara, I was actually going to, seeing that question in here, I was going to see if any of our colleagues from Cal OES are still on the line. I think I saw a couple of our colleagues in the attendee list earlier. So if anyone from OES is still on the line and maybe want to answer that question in the Q&A, that would be great. I think I'm hesitant to kind of give an answer specifically around FEMA funding requirements just because they are complex, and I think it would depend. So maybe if some of our OES colleagues are still on and they can give an answer, that would be great. If not, then Natalie, we can follow up with our colleagues at OES and FEMA to get a little bit more insight into that question, since we're not able to answer here now.
Awesome. Well, I'll move on to the next set of questions here and give OES folks a chance to weigh in if they want to. But I have a question from Isaac. If we have a list of jurisdictions that are compliant with SB 379, and do we have a link to those plans? So that's actually something that we're working on right now, and we're hoping to put all of the plans that we know of that are compliant onto the Adaptation Clearinghouse. So once that's done, then you'll be able to visit the Clearinghouse and type in the search bar SB 379, and all of the jurisdictions with plans compliant to SB 379 should pop up. And that should hopefully be updated in the next week or two. Okay, so we have one more question here for a general question on SB 379 for all panelists. How did you experience integrating climate mitigation and emissions reductions simultaneously? Or I guess this is maybe more specific to Angel and Leanne.
Yeah, so I can answer that first. So, you know, initially when the county first started its process to prepare the sustainability plan, our efforts actually began back in 2010, when the county's goal was simply just to identify energy cost savings that would result from the county reducing its energy consumption. And over the years, that sort of morphed into looking at additional strategies that would allow the community to also achieve cost savings from reducing their energy consumption. So that sort of morphed into the community-wide greenhouse gas reduction strategy. And as part of that, you know, as we worked through that analysis, became extremely clear that if you're going to go through that effort to reduce emissions, it certainly does make sense to have a plan in place to then mitigate for some of those effects that you're seeing from climate change that your community is already facing. Here in Placer, as I shared, we've had our fair share of wildfire impacts, drought, and bark beetle infestation. So, you know, we approached our board to expand on those goals that we established early on to prepare the greenhouse gas reduction component. And so with that, we added the vulnerability assessment, which essentially then allowed the county to demonstrate its compliance with SB 379.
And I'll add briefly, for our hazard mitigation plan, we really focused on the strategies that were what I would call like the win-wins that cover both mitigation and adaptation simultaneously. So things like building weatherization, energy conservation strategies, those that improve power resilience or power, you know, energy independence, and then the green infrastructure. For us, that's a really big, you know, as a coastal community where we are the end of the line for stormwater runoff, the green infrastructure is another really important component where talking about the benefits, not just to cooling effects, but also to improving our water quality and to improving our ability to absorb additional flooding that may occur. Some of the ways that we worked on integrating that into our hazard mitigation plan.
Awesome. Thank you all for y'all's answers on all those questions. We're about out of time today, and so I just wanted to wrap up by saying thank you to all of our panelists. Nguyen Tara Key, thank you for the overview on the ICARP. Leanne and Angel, thank you all for sharing y'all's experience in meeting SB 379 in y'all's jurisdictions. Again, I want to let everybody know that this is an ongoing webinar series, and we have different topics occurring on different Wednesdays coming up. So please, you know, tune in the future. Again, both the panelists' contact information can be found on this slide here, as well as if you have any general questions or questions about the webinar, or questions you don't know where to send them, if you go ahead and send them to webinar@opr.ca.gov, somebody over there will point you in the right direction and we'll get you situated as best we can. So, Nguyen Tara, I don't know if you have anything that you want to end with.
Just a thank you to everyone for sharing your experience and lessons learned. It's really helpful, and Yep, keep an eye out on the Adaptation Clearinghouse and OPR's resources for, additional guidance and resources that we're trying to provide to local communities as you're working to meet SB 379 requirements. And as Eric mentioned earlier, definitely reach out as, if you all have questions, if there are locals on the line who are working on SB 379 and would like help working through some of the guidance that we have out there. So a big thank you to everyone and everyone who helped pull this together.
Thank you all, and this will be the end of our Wednesday webinar on SB 379.